Welcome to the 100th anniversary celebration of the League of Women Voters of Louisville. 2020 marks the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment. That same year in 1920, both the League of Women Voters U.S. and League of Women Voters of Louisville both formed to educate voters, specifically women, before they cast their ballots. 100 years later, the League is still going strong, informing voters on issues and becoming advocates for policy. And in this important year, we commemorate the fuller history of suffrage by welcoming our special guest tonight, Dr. Carolyn Jefferson Jenkins, who in 1998 became the first African-American national president of the League of Women Voters. And the League of Women Voters of Louisville is making its own history this year, with Dr. Margie Cheresika elected as the first African-American president locally. We were hoping to celebrate in person tonight, but COVID had other plans. But as we all know, you can't keep a good woman down, and the League nationally and locally is full of them. So thank you for joining us virtually. Live from the Lang House, the headquarters of the League of Women Voters of Louisville, please welcome Dr. Margie Cheresika, the League's new president.
Good evening, everyone. I am Dr. Margie Cheresika, president of the League of Women Voters of Louisville. Welcome to our 100th anniversary celebration. The League has been planning this event for about a year, so as you can imagine, we are so excited to share with you this memorable event. Not only has significant progress been made toward helping women become a powerful voting force to be reckoned with, but also we continue to inform and educate the public to promote an informed electorate. So let's get started. It is my pleasure to introduce and welcome our mayor, the Honorable Mayor Greg Fisher, who will bring us a few words.
Hello, I'm Mayor Greg Fisher, and welcome to the 100th anniversary celebration of the League of Women Voters Louisville. I want to thank you all for all of the work that you've been put into this year, and I know with this pandemic, a few things have been thrown off track. But 2020, of course, marks the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment, and in that same year, 1920, the League of Women Voters Louisville formed to educate voters, specifically women, before they cast their ballots. 100 years later, the League is still going strong, informing voters on issues and becoming advocates for policy. And in this critical year, we commemorate the fuller history of suffrage by welcoming our special guest tonight, Dr. Carolyn Jefferson Jenkins, who in 1998 became the first African-American national president of the League of Women Voters. She'll talk about her new book, The Untold Story of Women of Color in the League of Women Voters. And the League of Women Voters Louisville is making its own history this year, with Dr. Margie Cheresika elected as the first African-American president locally. Thank you all, and have a wonderful evening.
Turn the program over to Rachel Platt, the moderator for tonight's program. Ms. Platt is a longtime and former journalist who worked for WHAS TV for 30 years. Deservedly, she was recently inducted into the Kentucky Journalism Hall of Fame and currently serves as the Community Engagement Director at the Fraser History Museum.
Thank you, Margie, very much. And we're kind of doing things with COVID rules here, so I'm going to put my microphone on. So it might seem a little bit cumbersome, but we want to follow all of the rules with social distancing and sanitation and keeping our masks on until we get up here to speak. So thank you so much, Margie. I really am honored to be here tonight to celebrate such important history, as we've been saying, with the centennial of the League of Women Voters and, of course, the passage of the 19th Amendment. How women have made their mark and continue to make their mark, certainly, with another glass ceiling shattered just this week with Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. I have learned so many names this year of women I didn't know about until this year. Names I should have known, I admit that, but I didn't, and boy have I learned. There aren't many things I thank 2024 in light of this pandemic, but I will say this year has been a turning point for a lot of us to learn a whole lot about suffrage and about the women who came before us and their relentless persistence to make things better for all of us. And of course, to learn the fuller story. You've heard so much about that lately, of so many women who were not included in that history for way too long. Tonight, it is not so much history, but her story. And we have plenty of stories that we're going to be sharing this evening. As we celebrate 100 years of the League of Women Voters US and the League of Women Voters of Louisville, we want to talk with 3 past presidents of the League of Women Voters of Louisville. If I read all of their accomplishments, I would never get to these interviews. So just so you know, these introductions have been shortened for convenience. We're going to start with Dot Ridings, who was president from 1972 to 1976, and then became a board member of the National League for 10 years. She would then serve as president of the League of Women Voters of the United States from 1982 to 1986. Most of Dot's professional work life was in newspapers as a reporter, editor, and a publisher. She came back to Louisville in 2005 and rejoined the local league, especially in the area of improving local public education. And next is Patricia Morrell. Pat became secretary to the league when she moved to Louisville in 1970. The balance of marriage and jobs had Pat coming and going with the league again in 1982, then again in 2010 when she retired. The league was always on her mind and one of her commitments. Her professional life was mostly in early childhood education, including daycares in the West End and teaching at Spalding. She says receiving the Lyman T. Johnson Award from Louisville Central Community Centers was one of the highlights of her life and was also a recognition of her league presidency. Our third past president is Dee Pregliasco. She served as president from 2016 until 2018. She's been a league member on and off since moving to Louisville to go to law school. She became a board member before her presidency began. As a teacher in her prior life, Dee is a retired practicing attorney after being a prosecutor, a judge, and a mediator. Still mediating, Dee is teaching the mediation seminar at the Brandeis School of Law at U of L. She is continuing her league work as VP of the State League and active in the outreach for registering citizens who have had their voting rights restored. Can I just say, well done, ladies. Very impressive, to say the least. And don't forget, that's the condensed version of all the accomplishments with these 3 esteemed women we're about to interview. So I'm going to interview the 3 of them. We're going to start by asking each of them the same question. So the first question that I want to ask, what is the biggest mark you think the League of Women Voters has made? And that could be nationally or locally. And we're going to start right here with Dot. So thank you, Dot. You answered. Talk about again, the biggest mark you think the league has made nationally or locally.
Listening to what Dot and Pat had, it's hard to sort of add to that, but I think that community engagement, that the league gets people involved in their community. So we not only study these issues, but we are engaged in the community as we educate the community. And I think that in and of itself is a great accomplishment. And it sort of goes to what Dot said about politics, you know, not just, there's nothing wrong with the garden club and there's nothing wrong with this club and that club, but this gets us involved in politics. The right to vote is all about politics.
Absolutely. All right, the second, you ladies, what was the biggest mark you think you made personally as president? Initiatives you saw as really important in your tenure. So this is the mark that you made personally, Dot.
Okay, first of all, I am going to mention though, the ERA arrived the year I became president. So we stepped in and absolutely worked so hard and are still working hard on that. But the most important thing during my presidency was involvement with the school systems. We at that time had 2 separate city and county school systems, totally separate. There had been a petition for a merger. 71, I believe, was when it was passed, and we worked hard to make that merger happen. We then worked very hard to make sure that it was done with a desegregated base of student opportunity, equity in education. We fought that issue, which was called the busing issue. Everybody talked about the bus at force, which is a misnomer, but took up almost all of the 4 years of the C and led to my testimony in Congress on that behalf against a strong group of opponents. But there's no question, and it's still with us. We're still working on that now.
I was going to say those issues haven't gone away, all of them, right?
Yes.
I mean, they're still here. How about you, Pat?
In 2010, I had not been active in League, and I saw in the CJ the list of newly elected officers to the League, and that I think is probably the last time it's been in there. But Beverly Moore was president, and I called her and I said, I'm ready to get back involved. And so she immediately put me on the board and gave me the capital campaign. My presidency was bookended by death. My daughter Allison died on February 8th, 2012, and I became president in June. So I needed the League more than you all needed me. And then my sister, Gail, died on April 2016. And Mary Jo Rogers, who was the first vice president, had to take over getting the meeting together. And thank you, Mary Jo. One of the things I did was move us beyond the East End. Our first annual was here in Limehouse, but it was very crowded. So the next year, we went to Hotel Louisville downtown, and our speakers were the president and mayor of Louisville Community Centers to introduce us to their new initiative called West of 9th to call attention to West Louisville. So the next year, we had our annual at Louisville Central Centers at 13th and Mahali. And the 2016, our speaker was African-American, Dr. Karen McDaniels, speaking on a brief history of Black women in Kentucky. And she mentioned Allen and Judge Denise Clayton. And I nudged her and I said, they're both here. Of that evening, though, for me, when Brenda Tuckson said, Pat, you make me feel welcome. I don't know who our first African American was. It may have been Mary. No, she chaired the immigration study sometime in that period. I'll go on. That we have added African American leadership. Beverly Moore had, and I did, and then Dee. The second time around, in 2018, we added the races for state legislature to our candidates forums for the first time. And our 20th annual meeting speaker was Renee Shaw. And here I'd like to say thank you to Susan Rostoff, who worked diligently on almost every one of these annual meetings. And my swan song, of course, was the LWVUS birthday party in February, it was in March.
But overall diversification is something that you are very, very proud of, and of course, to educate voters as well. Very good. All right, Dee, how about you?
Well, to build on that, I became president in July of 2000, and that was a summer where there were lots of police shootings of people of color, Black men. And so in August of that year, Usually we would not have an education program in August. We call them Dinner and Democracy. But we got together a panel of 5 local people, a prosecutor, a historian, a neighborhood activist person, and a judge, and a Black Lives Matter person. And we had a racial justice program. And so that, I feel like, is really my biggest accomplishment as league president. It sort of built on what was going on and had been going on in the league. But that really pushed us, I think, to the forefront that we had to deal with this issue of racial justice. And tied to that, the next year for the annual meeting, I got 2 Harvard professors who wrote a book that's very, very important and is still on the bestseller list in many ways. And it is one of the best books of I believe, 2019. And that's How Democracies Die by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. And they talked about all the things that we have seen really happening in the last 4 years. I was lucky. 2016 ignited, I think, activism in a way that it had not been ignited even before the election of 2016. So I benefited from that, and like we needed to take advantage of that and really move forward. And of course, as Pat said, I feel really good with our Racial Justice Committee. It's still in existence. It's put on programs, safe place for people to talk about race. And so we meet here and have been meeting here all these last 4 years. And it's really, I think, been a wonderful thing for our community as well as the community. And of course, the best part of that is we have Margie Cheresika as president.
Absolutely. And all of the things that you all have discussed, you know, it's not like history, it's still relevant. I mean, it's still unfolding unity. Every topic that you all named is still playing out.
Yes.
So making the news.
Could I add something?
Yes, ma'am.
The best attended community forums, the Dinner and Democracy, in the last were the ones during Dee's term. I don't know why, but I accept that she is a magnet.
But I do think people appreciate the envelope too,
Yes,
right?
so too, yes.
I mean, something resonated.
Yes.
People show reason. Finally, the third question to each, where do you see the league's biggest mark to make? What is that territory that you still need to get into? We just saw this election play out. Questions on voting, allegations of fraud and suppression. What is the important still left to do? And after this election, there might be a lot. I don't know.
Oh, I'm going to cheat just a little bit and just add one thing that I forgot to mention.
Okay, go ahead.
During my previous time, which was, and it speaks to the diversity of this organization. The first year of my presidency was the first year that men were formally invited to become full members of the League of Women Voters. Actually, this league had 2 what we called associate members, 2 men who had just believed so much in what we did that they paid their dues, they came to things and all that kind of stuff, but they couldn't be, quote, members. And they became members at the vote of the 72 convention, and I came home from that convention.
Biggest mark to make in the future.
And it should have really followed, because I've changed my mind. Work hard and harder than ever. I mean, it's something we've always had part of us, but we're going to have to work harder to convince people to be involved in the resurrection of working political, nonpartisan democracy. I do fear for democracy right now, and I think many people do, but I know we can overcome. Look at our 100 years. We've done things like
Well, I think to do and how to make sure it works. And I added that we must work to make sure everyone has a seat at the league table and also in the entire democracy. Paraphrase Al Smith,
Where do you see the league's biggest mark to make in the future?
Well, we're really associated with voting. So of course, getting out the vote is always an issue. Registering voters, we continue to do that. It's been harder, obviously, with COVID. But we have to deal with this issue that relates to democracy and it relates to racial justice, and that is voter suppression. And then we really have to work to make sure, and this is something that we've been working on all summer, is the outreach to former felons. In other words, people who've had their voting rights restored. You know, we're just one of 3 states that automatically said that if you were convicted of a felony, you couldn't vote and you could never vote. So we're working on that, and we have to continue on that because that's part of what Dot's saying about democracy. It's part of what Pat's saying about engaging people, because your vote does count. We have too many examples where, you know, it's been 1 vote, 5 votes, 87 votes, very, very close. Even this election, this presidential election, there's some close races. So we really have to continue moving forward in the future and working on all those core things that we stand for and which democracy stands for. And it should be nonpartisan, as Dot says.
And also, I know you had mentioned the fact that just the history that you all have made recently with Dr. Cheresika as well.
Yes. One last thing too, is part of all this was the year of the census. So one of the things that the league's involved in and working on is redistricting. Sometimes people don't know what redistricting is, so I always say gerrymandering, and everybody goes, oh yes, we have to get rid of gerrymandering. So we're working on that too, and that has to do with voting and voter suppression and being nonpartisan and being fair and open.
Well, ladies, thank you. Thank you for the mark that you have made in our community and continue to make. So we really appreciate that. Very informative. And we, of course, know that knowing our past informs the future. And our special guest this evening will share the league's past, present, and of course, as we look forward to the future. We want to let you know, we know you have questions for our special guest. So in the comment section of Facebook, go ahead and start putting your questions in, especially when she starts speaking. We will monitor those and ask her some of your questions. And here to introduce our special guest is longtime league member Susan Rostoff, who met Dr. Carolyn Jefferson Jenkins when she visited Louisville during her tenure as the national president from 1992 to 1998, to 2002. All right, Susan, we'll bring you over.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you to our past presidents. Happy to be here tonight and have this honor. It seems like yesterday, but it's actually been over 20 years since Dr. Carolyn Jefferson Jenkins spoke to the League of Women Voters of Louisville.
I'm just going to put that down a little bit for you there.
Okay,
Does that
thanks.
work? Okay.
Thanks. As a league board member, I got to interact with her in a number of arenas, and without doubt, I was overwhelmed. And so was our membership. She inspired us to keep moving forward with the league's stated mission and was the impetus for the Louisville League to take a close look at our membership composition. More about that later. Dr. Jefferson Jenkins grew up in Ohio, where from the get-go she was focused on social studies education and earned her PhD in urban education and administration. While earning her degrees, she worked as a public school teacher and administrator, and in 1982, she joined the League. The League of Women Voters was a platform to promote her passion, which was and is strengthening democracy at the grassroots by focusing on local elections. I'm going to say that again. Strengthening democracy at the grassroots by focusing on local elections. She knew it was at the local level that the league could most effectively carry out its programs. One high priority was registering people to vote and encourage women to run for office, she led the Get Out the Vote campaign, registering more than 50,000 new voters, mainly women and people of color. In the last year of her presidency, she promoted the Wired for Democracy project, one of the earliest efforts to increase citizen participation among the young via the newly developed internet. She also worked for campaign finance reform and healthcare, particularly for underserved populations. And today she continues building democracy internationally in South America, Africa, and Europe. In her spare time, Jefferson Jenkins is an author. Her latest book, which I believe has been mentioned, The Untold Story of Women of Color in the League of Women Voters. Which brings me to Dr. Jefferson Jenkins and the Louisville League. As I remember it, we had one African American member. We were well aware that we needed to change and change now. Dr. Jefferson Jenkins provided us the momentum, the example, and the inspiration to move forward in making our league a true representative organization of our population. No doubt in my mind, she was a beacon for all of us. I, for one, am deeply grateful and humbled to introduce to you Dr. Carolyn Jefferson Jenkins.
For that humbling introduction and for allowing us to reconnect after 20 years. That snapshot of what I've done in my life is important, but what's more important, just as it is for the former presidents that we've heard from, is who I am, what I stand for, and the work that I will continue to do to elevate the stories of women of color to their rightful place in history. Celebrations and anniversaries are about telling and remembering stories. And stories are used to inspire us, to inform us, and affirm us. Stories make a life once lived real. We have to take care of stories or they disappear. Untold stories leave us with a gap that sometimes makes us repeat the parts of history from which we should have learned. That is why I accept speaking engagements, not because I'm so special, but because I am on a crusade to give voice to the women of color who have been marginalized in history. I'm obligated because of their legacy to create a new conversation, a new space to promote actions that elevate their achievements, to shout the message loud and clear that we are more than a footnote. I do this by telling their story of passion and purpose and perseverance in the fight to navigate both gender and race. They did not have the luxury to choose just one. I am in a unique position, as you've heard tonight, to take up this charge because as the first and only woman of color to serve as national president of the League in its first 100 years, my actions are based not just on research, but my lived experience. And many of you have had similar experiences of being the first or being the only. So you can relate to the story that I will tell. I have a platform to do this, to take this moment and make it a movement. To do anything else would be irresponsible. So thank you to President Cherasika and to Dee Pregliasco for connecting with me at council and for her initial outreach that allowed me to connect with all of the remarkable members in the League of Women Voters of Louisville. To Adrian Wallace for his technical support and all who have brought together the resources to make this program possible. And finally, to each of you joining us this evening for your time, your interest, and all that you do to ensure a healthy, sustainable democracy and league in which we all are included. Now, it's difficult to follow the legendary former presidents and the work that they've done so far on social and racial justice, particularly Dot Ridings, who I haven't seen in a while, but Dot, as former national president, supported me during my tenure and that support was much appreciated. Some of you may remember that I was here for your 80th anniversary, and I have my Louisville Slugger to prove it. I still use it as a motivational tool to encourage people to vote. I also remember being heckled by a certain senator's supporters as I served on a panel advocating campaign finance reform. So a lot has changed in 20 years, especially this year with the election of the first woman and a woman of color to the position of Vice President of these United States. We have a lot to celebrate. I have been so impressed by the efforts of Kentuckians to include the stories of Black women in all of its centennial celebrations. Efforts that created the National Women's Suffrage Marker and the commitment of the William G. Pomeroy Foundation and the Louisville Historical Society and the universities to carry out research necessary to bring these stories to life. So this evening, I bring you greetings on behalf of all of the women who paved the way for those of us who are credited with making a difference. And I know that in the limited time that I have, it will be difficult to recount 100 years of history. But I will try, because this is not just a celebration, but an exercise in discovery of contributions forgotten, erased, or hidden. The history that many portray of the suffrage movement and its legacy is a romanticized, sanitized version of accomplishments and achievements, the things that we're most proud of, mentioning challenges only as they have impacted our work and to show how we overcame them. Our representation of history is similar to taking a selfie, using filters, getting the right angle, the right lighting. I hope that after our time together this evening, you will agree that there is importance in celebrating a complete history, even though it may not have been a celebration for everyone. That is why many organizations have chosen now to use the term commemorate instead of celebrate. The centennial commemorations in many instances are relying on bias as constructed, repeating a narrative and not questioning or pushing back. So I am going to challenge you to push back. I want to do three things. I want to acquaint you with women of color who labored in the suffrage movement who you may not know. Motivate you to continue the work that needs to be done to carry out their legacy, and challenge you to dream a better future for all of us. Before we begin, I also want to call to your attention that when speaking, I use the term women of color, colored women, Black women, and African American women, sometimes interchangeably, because in the United States, we have historically and still do struggle with identity labels. So all that being said, let's get started. In preparing my remarks, I asked myself why this topic would be of interest. I came to the conclusion that we need to be reminded of the power that we gain when we truly understand our history as a prelude to our future. I emphasize our because the most important part of history is the factual story, the story of everyone involved, even if it does not present us at our best. There are universal themes and struggles everywhere that transcend race. And the story that I'm about to tell spotlights those themes of passion, a sense of purpose, and perseverance. It's a story of courageous women who would not accept no for an answer. The story of brave women who would not be relegated to second-class citizenship in the suffrage movement or in the nation. And I have to admit, unfortunately, this story is not a history that I learned in school because women were often not represented in textbooks and women of color were totally invisible. As a result, telling this story is personal to me. I got to know these women that I studied, not just what they did, but what they thought, how they felt, the challenges they faced, and the triumphs that they constructed. Throughout this journey, not only did I learn about them, but I learned about myself and about the League of Women Voters and what I needed to do to make sure that their story, my story, was not lost to history. I learned that we need to insist that our story is told and how that story is told when there are competing narratives. The more I tell the story of the thousands of women of color whose names do not appear in the history books, the more that people hear the story, the more we should be compelled to change the narrative, acknowledge, honor, and rewrite. To turn back the clock 100 years and give credit to the women of color who made significant contributions to the suffrage movement and its legacy organization. What is important to note is that any commemoration must accept that the ratification of the 19th Amendment did not guarantee suffrage equality for all, but exposed the underlying issue of race. Why add this conversation now? Because it's time. We want our heroes to be perfect, and that's only human nature. But what history reminds us is that they are just people. History is messy, it's uncomfortable, and sometimes unbelievable, particularly on issues of race. But from acknowledging these unpleasant truths can come a brighter future. The history that has been omitted gives context to this current historic moment. The conversations on race are always uncomfortable, but being uncomfortable forces movement. Being okay with hard conversations move us forward. We are engaged in more than just an intellectual exercise. This is about real people and real thoughts. To be a suffragist as a woman of color meant a series of compromises and collaboration and controversy. On February 14, 1920, when the National American Woman Suffrage Association became the League of Women Voters, as founder Carrie Chapman Catt stated, the organization was established to finish the fight. Her intent in finishing the fight was to prepare women for the right that they had fought so hard for and the responsibility that came with it. On August 18, 1920, when the 19th Amendment was ratified, the fight was not finished because women of color, including Native American women, were still being subjected to racist barriers under what were known as Jim Crow laws, which prohibited the full implementation of the new amendment, particularly in the South. Catt also did not acknowledge that the discriminatory philosophy that was such an important part of the suffrage movement transferred into its legacy organization, the League of Women Voters, nor did she make any effort to change it. Each fight, fueled by hopes and dreams, was often stalled by realities. But it was the passion of these brave women of color that kept them in the fight. We must acknowledge that the history of the suffrage movement and the League of Women Voters is a paradox. It is a story of strategic choices and recurrent themes. It is a story of constant tension between principle and practicality. It is in this spirit of this history that I offer my remarks to share with you a celebration of women who persevered despite being discouraged. Women who have previously been relegated to the footnotes of history, but who from this day forward will receive their due. Adding the story of these women does not take away from anyone else's story. And it's important to acknowledge that people of color face unique challenges in the United States, and that women of color faced unique challenges in the suffrage movement and the League. Think about what it was like for these women, what it was like for me being the first, feeling a part of something bigger than yourself, fighting the good fight. In moments like this, people get excited about what has been accomplished, forgetting to acknowledge that the accomplishment may not mean the same thing for all. Hundreds of women of color made significant contributions to the women's suffrage movement and the League, many of whom you may never know because their involvement has been overlooked. So let me put a human face on what to many may be abstract. Sojourner Truth, Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune are names you may know. These are the 4 women most often associated with the celebrations. But what about the other abolitionists, suffragists, poets, teachers, public speakers, businesswomen, and writers? Black women who lived between 2 worlds, yet continued to fight because that was their purpose. Women such as Addie Waite Hunton, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Anna Julia Cooper, Nannie Helen Burroughs, Fannie Jackson Coppin, Hetty Tilghman, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. Should be noted that colored women started their own organizations because they were not accepted or valued as equals and had other priorities as well as suffrage, but never accepting no and realizing that the fight was not finished. Delilah Beasley wrote a weekly column on Negroes in California for the Oakland Tribune. She founded the Alameda County League of Women Voters, one of the colored leagues sanctioned by the national leadership. In February 2020, the New York Times wrote an article about her entitled, "The Pioneer Black Historian Who Was Almost Erased from History." There are certain truisms that we must accept, those that force the League of Women Voters to confront its painful history. The League of Women Voters has always struggled with issues of race and its relationship with its members of color. And after years and decades and generations, how then do we change this narrative of memory? As I thought about this centennial year, I wondered what I could do to help ensure that women of color were not overlooked. And so I decided my contribution would be to write the untold story of women of color in the League of Women Voters, realizing that we can better understand and appreciate ourselves if we know the story of all women who made significant contributions. The failure of historians to acknowledge the contributions that people of color made to society shaped my perception for years. So to that end, I made sure that every story, every woman of color discussed in the book is exceptional and representative of the hundreds of women who over the past 100 years have contributed to the League's enduring legacy at the local, state, and national levels. Women who have often been marginalized and placed in the footnotes. I recognize that whatever I accomplished in the League was because of the efforts of those women who came before me, both Black and white, who challenged the League to be true to its principles. I have been the beneficiary of so much that I feel I have a responsibility to push the League's thinking and ignite further action to preserve and celebrate the totality of the League's heritage. And as you may have discerned by now, I am unapologetic about raising the uncomfortable conversations that my research dictates, because there are consequences to being comfortable. The cover selected for the book is of 2 League members from Flint, Michigan, one Black, one white. That photo was taken in February of 1969 at a League event in Flint. And it is an important milestone because this was the first time the League used any photos of a woman of color in its publications to symbolize the organization. I learned some very interesting things about the League and its strategic decisions and its culture as it evolved through the 100 years that led me to ask further questions. What would have happened if women of color had been included as equals in the movement? What would have happened if the fight to finish became ensuring suffrage for women of color? What would the conversation have been had League leaders asked some more of the hard questions? What would the League look like today if it hadn't struggled with the issue of race in its membership? Because of my constant questioning, I decided when I was looking for chapter titles to reflect ideology instead of chronology. The ideology of these women of color in their quest to be fully recognized members of the movement and the League. And while the titles speak to the League of Women Voters, the message can apply to any organization or movement. Chapter titles such as Lest We Forget, to finish the fight, for the sake of the cause, the lessons of the hour, through amber-colored glasses, the League way, the weight of history, and moving forward the unfinished fight. Two caveats about my findings. One, my focus was on engagement with local and state leagues at the national level. And two, my research was limited by what we chose to save. But I did find that Kentucky played a part in the national conversation. For example, in 1923, white women in Louisville asked permission to organize an affiliated league for colored women. Names you might know: Mrs. Margaret Owens, Miss Edith Redwood, and Mrs. Paul Rittenhouse. I found consistently that the league often chose practicality over principle, and because of this, state and local leagues acted sometimes independently of the national leadership. I have had the opportunity to speak with pioneering women of color in the league. Sandra Epps, who is the woman of color who appears on the cover of my book, who just turned 85, had an interesting story to tell. A story that was just recently in the news, and many of you may be familiar with. There was a story about a 94-year-old woman who drove 300 miles to vote, and that was Mildred Madison. And she is also mentioned in the book. She was my mentor in the League of Women Voters of Cleveland, and I would have expected nothing less from her as a league member. I also had the opportunity to speak to Dr. Josie Johnson, who was the first national Black board member in 1968, and Gracia Hillman, who was the first woman of color to serve as executive director of LWVUS. I was enthralled with the stories that they had to tell. So I come before you this evening, leaving nothing to chance, to remind you that the contributions of everyone's life deserves more than a footnote. I am more than a footnote. You are more than a footnote. We are more than a footnote. A familiar message in an ever-changing, uncertain world. So how then do we celebrate, knowing that the past 100 years were not perfect? How do we make sense of the changes in the society and the democracy? The centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment offers a major opportunity to acknowledge and honor our unabridged history, a history that incorporates and celebrates women of color in their rightful place. It is time. For 100 years, suffragist history and the history of the League marginalized the contributions of women of color. We can give ourselves permission to celebrate a flawed history, knowing that we can create a new narrative. We must proclaim the importance of history and use it as a blueprint for the future, recognizing that we live in a dynamic society, that progress is fragile, that if we are not vigilant, we will lose the gains that we have made. Understanding this allows us to amplify the good and learn from the inexcusable. No words are sufficient to express my gratitude for the women who paved the way for me. My determination to honor their legacy is a weight that I am willing to bear. Disclosing the untold story of women of color in the League of Women Voters and affirming their unique challenges allows us to reimagine the organization of the next 100 years. Facilitating inclusion that is not tied to a specific moment in time, but is a part of the organization's fabric that cannot be frayed. So we celebrate, knowing that things are not perfect, not in 1920, not in 2020. We celebrate by acknowledging our past as a prelude to our future, by telling the truth and using the lessons learned to do better, by moving forward, by imagining the unimaginable, by reclaiming the power in our complete story, by removing barriers, by finishing the fight, by making courage more contagious than fear, by telling the untold story of women of color in the suffrage movement and its legacy organization, the League of Women Voters. Let our voices be the voices of reason in 2020 and beyond. Let's educate, let's talk to each other, let's listen to each other. I am an eternal optimist, and I continue to be inspired by your energy and commitment. So let's link arms virtually until we can do it in person to honor those women who risked their lives and gave their lives. Every grandmother, mother, aunt, sister, daughter, grandfather, father, partner, uncle, son, every person who refuses to be labeled, and recognize that we are forever linked in this pursuit of justice and equality. In conclusion, we here this evening dream on behalf of others. And my dream for the next 100 years is that the League of Women Voters will celebrate all people in reality, not just rhetoric, in value, not just voice, in beliefs, not just benefits gained, no quotas, no stereotypes, no labels, no double standards, without the residue of race. So at this 100th anniversary commemoration of the ratification of the 19th Amendment and the League of Women Voters of Louisville, in this new normal on November 12, 2020, I am issuing a challenge to each of you on behalf of all women who came before us and chose to make this world a better place in whatever way they could. I challenge you to do the same, to stand up again and again, all of us, until we have achieved equality. This is our future. Thank you for all that you do. Thank you for all that you will do. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this evening's conversation. I can't wait to see what the future holds.
We have some questions that we want to ask you. So you've laid down that challenge to stand up and to push back. As we know, history is messy, but we've learned so much about it and how much better we can do moving forward when all voices are amplified, without a doubt. You mentioned it early on, and I wanted to go back, if you don't mind, to that, another glass ceiling being shattered with the election of Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, and the saying that we keep hearing, you can't be what you can't see. And tell us what this moment in time means that you think to you personally and to the nation.
Thank you for that question. Let me start with to the nation first and then to me personally. To the nation, it shows the realm of possibilities. And one of the things that Vice President-elect Harris said in her speech was that little girls looking at her can aspire to be her. But I would add that not only little girls looking at her, but all of us looking at her admire what it is that she has accomplished, because those of us who have been the first and the only, and that's many of us, we know what the challenges are. We know the microaggressions we have to deal with on a daily basis. We know the lack of support that is sometimes available to us in certain circles. And to have achieved at that level is indeed phenomenal. To me personally, it is the continuation of the evolution of what my grandmother sewed into my life. And I often tell the story of my grandmother, whose poll tax receipt I keep as an artifactual reminder. And my grandmother was born in 1903. In 1920, she graduated normal school so that she became a teacher. In the mornings, early mornings, she would pick cotton. In the mid-morning, she would teach school, and in the evening, she would teach people to write so that they could sign their names to vote. And it was not until she was 62 years old that she could vote without the encumbrances that were prevalent in the South. At the age of 62, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, and she was able to vote without those encumbrances. What is very interesting in reviewing her poll tax receipt, and it took me a couple of years to figure this out, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed in August of 1965, and her poll tax receipt is dated October 1965. And what that says is that just because laws are passed doesn't mean that they are implemented. So she would be thrilled to see the progress that is being made, but she would also cautiously remind us that we have to be vigilant, that progress is very fragile.
Question I wanted to ask you, and this is from one of our past presidents. How did you originally become involved with the League of Women Voters? What led you specifically to that organization?
And this is my league story, and Dot has heard this story before. In the 1970s and 80s, the league was known for hosting presidential debates. And at the time, in 1980, I was living in Cleveland, and as the good political science teacher that I was, I wanted tickets to attend the presidential debate. And I was told that in order to get tickets, I had to be a league member. And so I said, okay, what does it cost? I wrote a check and I became a league member. Unfortunately for the league, they sent me the voter, the local voter. I found out when the board meetings were, and I attended a board meeting. And I said, now that you have my money, what is it that you do? I always knew of the League of Women Voters, and I was always active in the community, but I did not see the league as an organization that I would affiliate with. I rarely saw anybody of color in any league publications or at any league meetings. And so I just didn't think that that was the organization for me. After attending the board meetings and learning about the projects and getting involved in the league, I stuck around. And I always say, be careful who you open your doors to, because 40 years later, I'm still here and making a contribution to the organization.
Let me ask you another question. When you got that call to accept the nomination back in February of 1998 to run for president, a lot was going through your mind. What were your considerations as you accepted, knowing that you were going to be a first? And what was the reaction to you being nominated?
That's such a complicated question. There were so many things going through my mind. And I don't think that at that moment, I was as concerned about being the first as I was about being prepared to take on the enormity of the job. I had worked my way through the league at the local and state level. I had been on the national board and had served as second vice president prior to getting the call to become president. And so I knew the scope of the work. And I actually was working full time. So I was trying to figure out how I'm going to balance working full time, which I needed to do, and being the full-time president of the league with the enormity of the responsibility that I knew came with it. And I always tell the story that I became league president because I worked my way through the ranks, labored in the trenches. And what I learned as I went out to speak during my first year of my presidency was that I was Black. So once elected, I did recognize the enormity of the moment. And it was a time of change for the organization. And I always say I brought the league kicking and screaming into the 21st century. But there was a lot of change that was taking place. I was fortunate in that traditionally Black organizations formed a circle of support for me and were there. They recognized the enormity of the election, as did I. And they formed a network of support for which I was very thankful, because there was no one else who had walked in my shoes before. And it is always a daunting task. And in the book, the chapter I refer to that is called The Weight of History, because I knew as I was nominated, I started looking into the history of the league, and I'm like, where are the women of color? There had to have been some women of color. And Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn had a book that came out that very year about African-American women in the suffrage movement, in the struggle for the right to vote. And I used that book as a grounding for the history of what it was like for women of color to have struggled. And so one of the interesting things when you're the first and when you're the only, oftentimes people want to label you and put you in a box so that they can understand you, not recognizing that you are where you are because you've overachieved, not because someone gave you something. And I always think about people saying we gave women the right to vote. People don't give you anything. And so the achievements and accomplishments that got me to that point are what I try to honor, because I know I stand on the shoulders of those women who never received recognition. And so that's a long-winded answer to your question, but it's a complicated question, and there are so many emotions that are involved in what goes on with accepting that role and accepting in honor of those women who never got the chance to have that role.
When I was reading the book too, that with your mother, you lost her right at that very same time. And I can't even imagine the emotional turmoil with that too, that was happening as all that was playing out, correct?
That's correct. My mother passed away on June 10th, and I was elected president on June 16th. So I did not spend much time at convention that year. I actually only went back on the 15th, after the day after we buried my mother, and was just there in time to accept the nomination. So yeah, it was, I thought about her, and I also thought a lot about my grandmother, who at the time was 95 years old. And I thought about how they grew up in a segregated society and could not have even imagined such a thing taking place. And so I accepted the presidency and the responsibility on behalf of both my grandmothers and my mother.
This is from Cindy. What can the League of Women Voters do to help our communities address and overcome institutional racism?
The League is a powerful, impactful, credible organization. And the League's use of resources in overcoming the issues that we deal with on social and racial injustice are important. Historically, there have been times when we've shied away from that, and we can take the lead in that. And part of the reason that we shied away is what I consider to be uncomfortable conversations about ourselves and who we are. Unfortunately, in the early years of the League, many of the relationships between the League and communities of color was transactional, not transformational. And by transactional, what I mean is when we needed access to a particular community, or when we needed to partner with somebody, we did that, but we didn't nurture the relationships to continue them. We didn't nurture and develop the kind of collegiality and the investment in other people that would sustain the kinds of relationships that we need. The issues that we are tackling now are monumental for this nation, and that's in the League's sweet spot. That's who we are as an organization. Let's just make sure that we are willing to take the leap and make some transformational changes. I was encouraged by the fact that diversity, equity, and inclusion is now in the bylaws. That gives it some accountability to local and state leagues, and that's going to help push that conversation forward. But the League can serve as the convener of all these coalitions of people. The League can use its resources to help make this conversation stay at the forefront for everyone. And as I am looking at the League's next 100 years, I see that the mechanisms are being put in place to do just that.
Reach out to other silent groups, Latinx, Asian, Native American, and thus enriching their experience.
I'm sorry, could you repeat? I did not hear the first part of that question.
Yes, ma'am. How do we reach out to other silent groups, Latinx, Asian, Native American, and thus enriching their experiences?
We reach out by just doing it and not expecting something in return. We have to value all people. The demographics of this nation are changing. And if we don't recognize that and change our structures to accommodate that, and change our philosophy to accommodate that, and change our messaging to accommodate that, then we will not be able to stay relevant. Targeting our messaging is an important piece of that. Changing our attitudes about who we reach out to. And I know it's comfortable in grassroots organizations to invite your friends to join. Do a little bit more outreach. Go another concentric circle out from your comfort zone. Make an investment in other people. People are drawn to organizations like the League because of issues. We are in the conversation about the issues right now that help us make sense out of what's going on, particularly as it relates to this whole election season. That's what the League is known for. We can go and make sure that we are making an investment in young people, making an investment in every demographic group that exists, and showing that not only do we want you when we need you, we want to be a part of what it is that you're doing. And prioritizing that work. We have to prioritize that work. We have to make sure that our images and our messages are inclusive. We have to make sure that every time that we have the opportunity to invite in someone else, that we do that.
Transactional versus transformational. I'm going to remember that one, that's for sure. Another question for you. What strategies can women use to shape the political conversation over the next 4 years?
Wow, I don't know that I'm the best person to answer that. That's a loaded question. You know what? I think of kitchen table conversations that then turn into policy conversations. I think about protests that then lead to policy. I think about all of the things that we do on a daily basis, how we have an observers corps, how we write blogs, how we manage to gain visibility for the organization. All of those conversations lead to empower women. And the other piece is we need to support each other. And we need to form and strengthen the networks where we can support each other. Everyone doesn't have to be the show horse. There are people who need to be the workhorse. And regardless of where you are on that continuum, we just need to support each other. Women are more than 50% of the population, more than 50% of the voting population. Women have made significant strides in Congress, but they're still only 23%. When we get to 52%, then that would be fine. But there are so many other people who are much smarter than I am on this topic who would probably have some commentary to add. So I'll leave that to them.
One I think you'll enjoy as well. What is your opinion about making the goal of the national popular vote as the determining factor for electing our president? The Electoral College is an outdated model. Can the League of Women Voters lead the charge for this change?
The League of Women Voters has been leading that charge for quite some time. 20 years ago, I gave a speech on abolishing the Electoral College. The League, that has been the League position. And the League has done the studies. The League has the research. The League right now has the opportunity to dust all of that off and become more visible and vocal about eliminating the Electoral College. So this is nothing that's new for the League. It's just a new conversation for the nation, and the League can take the lead in this.
One thing I wanted to ask you after reading your book, there was something in it that really struck me. When you were elected president, your formal office photo that you chose to do. Can you tell the story about that? That really moved me. Yours was different and you wanted it to be. And tell people about that.
Okay, so in our past league office, as you walk down the corridor, all of the league presidents' photos were on the wall in the order in which they served as president. And when I was elected, all of those photos were in black and white. And so when I was elected president, I had my photo in color. And the symbolism of my photo being in color was twofold. One, because it showed that this was an evolution from an all-white group of women to adding some color to the conversation. And the second was that it was a challenge for us to make sure that we had some color in the conversation. And so you'd walk down the hall and you'd see 14 white women and me in living color.
One other question that I wanted to ask you, telling the fuller story of women of color has been so important in 2020. As I said, I've been embarrassed by names I didn't know at my age and the fuller history being told now. I remember the op-ed piece by Brent Staples, and that was a real eye-opener. Your book was already in the works. You were already thinking along those lines. What led you to think, this is time? This is my time to tell this story. What was that I guess the reckoning for you that you said, it's time now?
The reckoning for me began in 1998 when I was elected. And especially the first year that I was president, and as I tried to find where the history was and couldn't find it. And as I went around and visited, and I went to almost every state during my presidency, and I met with women of color who had private stories to tell. There's the public face, and then there's a private face. And the stories that they would tell touched me. And I started collecting in 1998 their stories. And I recognized that as we got closer and closer to the 100th anniversary, that I wasn't comfortable that these women's stories would be told, or that the league history would have a prominent place for them as we recorded the history of our 100th anniversary. I also recognized during my tenure that I would be the only one in the first 100 years. And that was very clear to me. So I had an obligation to make sure these stories weren't lost. So I began collecting data in 1998, and it's interesting because Mildred Madison, who I spoke about as the 94-year-old woman who drove 300 miles to go vote, I met her, again, reconnected with her when she was in Detroit, and she gave me her phone number at the time. And actually, when I called her to do her interview last year, her daughter said, "Where did you get this number?" I said, "She gave it to me 20 years ago. I kept it all this time because I knew something had to be done." Writing this book initially was more cathartic for me than it was for making a statement. And I could not count on other people to bring this history to light. I am encouraged, however, by the number of scholars and researchers and journalists who have taken the lead also on bringing these stories to light. Just as an aside, one of the things that is interesting to me is the League was founded in February of 1920, and the ratification was in August, yet in all of the documentaries about the suffrage movement, it does not make that transition. And so the League of Women Voters is left out in that conversation. And so much of what is in my book, which deals with suffragists, people overlook because they're not making the connection between the fact that the League existed prior to the ratification of the 19th Amendment.
Final question for you, and this kind of goes to the practicality versus principle, and I think moving forward as women, and how do we get to this place where we lift each other up? The question from an audience member, why do you think that other women are so hard on other women?
Again, one of those extremely complicated multi-level questions. I think that for my generation, society did not always encourage women to engage in team sports. Team sports were not a big thing then. And so women see themselves as individuals and not as necessarily team players. One of the other things that I would add is that when women are the first or the only, bringing on someone else sometimes tends to minimize the importance of that person's role. And that's the perception, that's a perception that we have in society. And that also has been my experience. But women are learning now to network and help each other. But that has not been how our society has raised women to be. And Title IX was a big factor in moving that forward, because women then had team sports and women became team players and they became supportive of each other. And I have to say that my early mentors were men, because I couldn't find women who would be willing to mentor me. I, therefore, have made it an intentional goal of mine to mentor as many women as I can, and to lift up as many women as I can, and to make sure that I develop as many women as I can, because it's important for us to do that. But the question is more of a societal question than it would be linked to any particular organization.
And boy, aren't we missing out, though, by not lifting each other up. And I agree with you, being a mentor and knowing that we're stronger together. And I think that is so much what the book said, so much that history has taught us, that when we don't pull for each other and we're not, and lifting each other up, just the detriment of that. And as I've said, 2020 to me is, with this pandemic, the one bright light has been learning, the fuller history and names I didn't know. And I'm so glad that I did get to know. A final comment just from one of our past presidents said, thank you for writing this book. Thank you for pushing back, and thank you for being the spirit you are. Did you have any final words you would like to leave with our audience before I turn this back over to Dr. Cherasika?
I would just like to say congratulations, Dr. Cherasika. You certainly will move the league in a new direction for this next 100 years. I just want to say everyone that has been mentioned in the book, everyone that has shown interest in the book, everyone that I have ever worked with or touched tangentially in my league journey has been phenomenal. And everyone has been open to this conversation. What I need you to do now is to move it to the next level, and do that on behalf of the women who we're now learning about, and do that on behalf of the change that this nation just made, and do that on behalf of the organization that we know we can be. So thank you again for your time and your interest and your engagement this evening. I truly, truly, truly appreciate it.
Joining us. And again, thank you for writing this book. Thank you for your voice and your leadership throughout the years, and your persistence, obviously, to bring about change. We really do appreciate it. We've learned so much from you tonight. So thank you for your time. I'm going to now turn the program back over to Dr. Margie Cherasika. We have a special surprise, and she's going to be talking about that as well. Dr. Cherasika, and I think we'll bring your mic. We'll switch out again, okay? There we go.
Wow, what a wonderful program. I hope you enjoyed that heartfelt, informative presentation as much as I did. This year has been so unprecedented. From the pandemic to our local league's election of its first African-American president, to the recent election of the first Black Asian American vice president-elect. It seems that we have come full circle in so many ways. Yet, we do not fool ourselves into believing that the journey for diversity, equity, and inclusion has been met for women in general and women in color in particular. The election of the first woman vice president-elect of the United States would not have been possible without women being a powerful voting bloc. All of this was made possible by the 19th Amendment and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Vice President-elect Kamala Harris said in her recent speech that her recent acceptance speech that her mother had once told her that we must move forward unburdened by what has been. And I would add, we must continue to persist in the face of opposition for what is right. On top of all this, we were recently gifted a portrait of Ida B. Wells by Laura Rothstein, former dean of Brandeis Law School of University of Louisville. Locally, we will place this portrait on the wall along with the other suffragists where it deserves to be, but not at the time. It wasn't on the wall at that time because for many years because of the intersection between gender and race. Thank each of you for coming out this evening to share this celebration of our 100th anniversary. Special thanks to our guest speaker, Dr. Carolyn Jefferson Jenkins, former President Dot Ridings, who's also a 50-year member, I might add, Dr. Patricia Morrell, and Dee Pregliasco. And of course, our moderator, Rachel Platt. I would also like to take this opportunity to name our other 50-year member, which is Beverly Moore. She's not here tonight with us, but certainly we want to recognize both Dot as well as Beverly. We want to thank also those that have contributed financially to this event because it would not maybe have been possible without your assistance. So with that said, I want to say, let us continue to move onward together for a more perfect democracy. Good night.